Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to discover an emotional story about a woman who suddenly returns after 20 years of disappearance. But the daughter she left behind may not be ready to accept her again. What would you do if someone from your past came back when your heart had already learned to live without them? If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Morning arrived slowly over the small countryside house. Not with noise or urgency, but with a pale layer of light spreading quietly across the damp soil outside. The air still carried the coolness of the night. Dew clung to the leaves in the garden behind the house, thin and fragile, trembling every time the wind moved through. Nothing here ever seemed rushed. Even time itself felt slower. Diep was already awake. She stepped out into the yard with silent movements, tying her hair back loosely while carrying an old woven basket under one arm. The wooden door behind her closed softly. No dramatic sounds, no voices calling out. Just the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional cry of chickens somewhere beyond the fence. The garden stretched quietly in front of her. Long rows of vegetables covered the narrow piece of land beside the house. Loofahs hanging low from bamboo frames, pumpkin vines crawling close to the soil, clusters of green leaves still wet from the morning mist. Everything looked imperfect in a way that made it real. Some plants grew unevenly. Some leaves carried tiny holes left by insects. But the garden was alive, cared for patiently by hands that understood hardship better than comfort. Diep bent down near the loofah vines. Her fingers brushed lightly against one of the fruits, testing its firmness before twisting it carefully from the stem. She placed it into the basket beside her. Then another, and another. The motions repeated quietly, steady, practiced. There was something almost mechanical about the way she worked, but not cold. It was the rhythm of someone who had done the same thing for years until labor no longer required thought. Her body remembered, even when her mind wandered elsewhere. A soft breeze moved through the garden and lifted the edge of her shirt slightly. Somewhere nearby, a chicken scratched at the dry soil, making small cracking sounds against the ground. Diep paused for a brief second and looked toward the sound, before continuing again without speaking. Silence never bothered her. In fact, silence had become part of her life a long time ago. There were moments when her hands slowed slightly, as if something had crossed her mind unexpectedly. A memory, perhaps, or maybe only the shape of one. But whatever it was, she never held on to it for long. She simply continued working, lowering her gaze back to the vegetables in front of her. By the time the basket was nearly full, sunlight had started spreading across the yard more clearly. The cool gray of dawn slowly disappeared beneath warmer tones. Inside the house, small footsteps echoed faintly. "Mom," Nee's voice came softly from the doorway. Diep turned immediately. Something in her expression changed the moment she saw the little girl standing there, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The tension that quietly sat in her shoulders loosened. She walked over and crouched down slightly, brushing messy strands of hair away from Nee's forehead. "You're awake already?" Nee nodded. I'm hungry. A faint smile appeared on Diep's face. Small, tired, real. I'll make breakfast soon. The child leaned lightly against her arm without saying anything more. It was a simple habit between them, one repeated so many times it no longer needed explanation. Diep rested her hand briefly on Nie's head before standing again. The morning continued quietly. Steam rose from a small pot inside the kitchen while sunlight slowly filled the house. Nie sat on a wooden chair, swinging her legs absent-mindedly while Diep prepared food. Neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. After breakfast, Diep gathered the vegetables she had harvested earlier and prepared to head to the market. The village market was small, crowded mostly with familiar faces and routines that rarely changed. Vendors arranged fruits and vegetables beneath faded umbrellas, while customers moved slowly between narrow walking spaces. Voices overlapped softly across the warm air, bargaining, greeting, laughing briefly before moving on again. Diep spread an old mat on the ground and placed her vegetables neatly in front of her. Not arranged beautifully, just honestly. "Homegrown vegetables," she said quietly to passing customers. Her voice was never loud, but people still stopped. One woman picked up a loofah and examined it carefully. "How much?" 15,000. The woman hesitated slightly before pointing toward a smaller one. "What about this?" 10. The exchange ended with a simple nod. Money passed from one hand to another. Quick, practical. No unnecessary conversation followed. Another customer stopped to buy pumpkin leaves. An older man asked whether the vegetables had been sprayed with chemicals. Diep shook her head calmly. "No pesticides. Grown at home." The man nodded with satisfaction and bought 2 bundles. The hours passed this way. Simple conversations, simple transactions, a life built from repetition. Yet sometimes, between customers, Diep's gaze drifted somewhere beyond the market, not toward any specific person, not toward anything visible. It was the look of someone briefly distracted by thoughts they never fully allowed themselves to enter. Then Nie appeared beside her again. "Mom?" Diep looked down. Nie crouched beside the vegetables and picked up a pumpkin leaf curiously before placing it back in the wrong pile. Diep quietly fixed it without scolding her. "You have to stay close." "I know." The child smiled lightly before leaning against her shoulder. For a brief moment, everything felt complete in its own quiet way. Not happy, not sad, just stable. And maybe stability was enough. By late afternoon, the sunlight began to soften. The market slowly emptied as people packed away their goods and returned home. Diep tied the remaining vegetables together and lifted the basket again. The walk back was peaceful. Dust rose faintly beneath their footsteps along the narrow path leading home. Nie hummed softly to herself while occasionally kicking small stones across the road. When they finally reached the house, the sun had already lowered behind the distant trees. The yard looked exactly the same as it always did. Still, familiar, untouched. Diep placed the basket down near the doorway and carried a few vegetables toward the washing area outside. Water flowed over her hands in clear streams while loose leaves drifted slowly away. Then, a shadow appeared at the edge of the path. Diep did not turn immediately, but she felt it. Someone was standing there, watching quietly. The air changed in a way too subtle to explain. Not danger, not fear, just interruption. After a few seconds, Diep finally lifted her head. A woman stood near the entrance to the yard, older, tired. Her clothes carried traces of travel dust. One hand gripped the strap of a worn bag, while her eyes slowly moved across the house, the garden, the ground beneath her feet. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she looked around as though searching for something that no longer existed. Diep straightened slowly. The woman finally took a small step forward. This place, her voice stopped halfway. She looked toward the empty area beside the house again, eyes lingering there longer than necessary. My house used to be here. Silence followed. Only the sound of water dripping from Diep's fingertips onto the dirt below remained between them. The woman's gaze stayed fixed on the land, as if memory itself had brought her back there after 20 years, only to discover that nothing had waited for her return. The woman remained standing near the entrance to the yard, long after her words faded into silence. Evening light stretched across the ground between her and Diep, thin and pale now, slowly losing warmth as the sun disappeared behind the distant trees. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, before everything settled back into stillness. Diep turned off the water tap beside her and wiped her hands against her shirt. She studied the stranger carefully for the first time. The woman looked exhausted, not only from traveling. There was another kind of exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that stayed inside a person for years until even standing still seemed difficult. Dust clung faintly to the hem of her pants. Her hair had loosened from whatever careful arrangement it once held earlier in the day. Yet despite the tiredness, her gaze remained fixed on the land around the house with unsettling attention, as if every corner still belonged to a memory she could see clearly. "I used to live here," the woman said again, softer this time. "A long time ago." Diep glanced briefly toward the empty patch beside the garden before looking back at her. "How long?" The woman lowered her eyes for a moment, calculating silently. "About 20 years." The number settled heavily in the air. 20 years was long enough for trees to disappear, long enough for walls to collapse, long enough for an entire life to vanish without leaving proof it had ever existed. The woman gave a faint smile, though it carried no real warmth. "I almost couldn't recognize it anymore." Diep said nothing. There was nothing appropriate to say to someone mourning a place. Ni stepped out from behind the doorway then, curiosity overcoming caution. She held a small piece of pumpkin leaf in one hand and stared openly at the stranger. The woman noticed her immediately. Something shifted across her face. Not surprise, something deeper. Her eyes softened so quickly it almost looked painful. "This is your daughter?" she asked quietly. Diep nodded once. "Nai?" The little girl remained close to the doorway, watching carefully. The woman crouched slightly, despite the visible stiffness in her movements. "How old are you?" "4." Ni answered without hesitation. A small smile appeared on the woman's face again, more fragile this time. "Such a big girl already." The words escaped almost like a thought spoken aloud, rather than conversation. Nee tilted her head slightly before asking the question children always asked strangers. "What's your name?" The woman hesitated. "Dieu." The name sounded strangely soft against the evening air. Nee repeated it once quietly, as though testing how it felt to say. Then, without warning, she stepped closer. "You can come inside." Diep looked toward her daughter immediately, but Nee continued speaking naturally. "It'll get dark soon." The woman froze for half a second. Only half, but Diep noticed that tiny pause, that flicker in the woman's expression, like someone holding themselves together too tightly. "Oh, I don't want to bother you," Dieu said gently. "You won't," Nee answered before Diep could speak. The child's innocence made the silence afterward feel heavier somehow. Diep glanced toward the road beyond the house. The sky had darkened further while they stood talking. Evening in the countryside arrived quickly once the sun disappeared. Soon, the narrow paths would become difficult to walk safely. She looked back at Dieu again. The woman still stood there carrying her worn bag, uncertain whether to stay or leave. Yet there was something else beneath that uncertainty, something quiet and almost invisible, reluctance, as though leaving this place again would cost her more than she expected. "It's late," Diep finally said. Dieu looked up immediately. "You can stay here tonight if you want." The words came simply, calmly, no dramatic kindness attached to them. Still, the woman stared at her as though she had misheard. "Stay here? Just for the night?" Another silence stretched between them. Wind moved lightly through the garden behind the house, rustling leaves against bamboo frames. The sound seemed unusually loud now. Dieu lowered her eyes quickly. For a brief moment, Diep thought the woman might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded once. "Thank you." The gratitude in her voice felt too heavy for such a small offer. Nee smiled immediately and walked toward the doorway again, as though everything had already been decided. "Come inside, Grandma." The word landed softly. Grandma. No hesitation, no confusion, just natural instinct. Dieu stopped walking. Her entire body seemed to still at once. Diep felt it too, that strange pause in the air. Nye blinked innocently, unaware of what had changed. Dieu looked down at the little girl standing beside her. Her lips parted slightly, though no words came out at first. Then slowly, very slowly, she smiled. A real smile this time, small, unsteady, painfully warm. "All right," she whispered. The three of them entered the house together. Inside, the fading evening light mixed with the dim yellow glow of a single hanging bulb. Shadows stretched quietly along the wooden walls, while the scent of washed vegetables and cooked rice lingered in the warm air. Nee climbed onto a chair near the table, while Diep moved toward the kitchen area again. Without speaking much, she reached automatically for the vegetables she had washed earlier and began preparing dinner. Behind her, Dieu sat quietly near the doorway, watching. Not the house, not the objects inside it. Diep, every movement, the way she pushed loose hair behind her ear while cutting vegetables, the way she crouched slightly near the stove, the calm rhythm of her hands. Dieu's gaze never wandered far. At first, Diep tried to ignore it. Then eventually, unable to avoid the feeling any longer, She glanced back over her shoulder. The woman looked away, almost immediately. "You should rest," Diep said softly. "I'm not tired." But the answer came too quickly, too carefully. Diep returned her attention to the stove while oil crackled quietly in the pan. Outside, darkness settled fully over the yard. Inside, something unspoken slowly began taking shape between them. Not recognition, not yet, but close enough to disturb the silence. Diep lives a quiet life in the countryside, raising her young daughter while working hard in her small vegetable garden every day. Everything seems peaceful until a strange woman suddenly appears at her house, claiming she once lived on that land 20 years ago. As the evening passes, the woman becomes emotionally attached to Diep and little Nai, especially when the child innocently calls her grandma. During dinner, painful memories slowly begin to surface. Diep reveals that she grew up without truly knowing what happened to her parents, while the mysterious woman quietly struggles with emotions she cannot confess. The tension rises when she asks one heartbreaking question. If Diep's mother were still alive and came back one day, would she accept her? Beneath the silence of one ordinary night, a hidden truth slowly begins to awaken.